A very good evening to one and all. As all of us know that COVID-19 has had its effects on almost all sectors of life, society and nation. And because of human beings' unabashed assault on the natural ecosystem, which has been the primary source of the spread of the virus in the first place. We are also aware that the need of the hour is, of course, to contain the virus and find a definitive cure for it. Any complacency towards the environment would make human lives more and more unsustainable on this planet Earth. To understand more about the state of environment and the prospects, the Center for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at Impact and Policy Research Institute has launched Planet Talks, wherein experts would join us in a discussion and share their views. At the launch of the Planet Talks, we are fortunate to have with us a key campaigner on critical issues of environmental and social justice, Mr. Leo Saldanha. Mr. Saldanha is the founding trustee and coordinator of the Environmental Support Group based out of Bangalore. He has guided several campaigns demanding evolution of progressive laws and effective action. Mr. Saldanha has been the country coordinator and faculty of two courses, Cities in 21st Century and Health and Community courses of the International Honor in the US. And he has also been the co-director of the Minnesota Studies in International Development at University of Minnesota. His papers and articles appear in leading journals and newspapers and are widely read. Some of his prominent work include Green Tapeism, a review of the Environmental Impact Assessment Notification 2006, Living Rivers, Dying Rivers, India's Risks, Democratizing the Management of Threats to Environment, Health and Values, through the water landscape, evaluating the environmental and social consequences of the POSCO project in Odisha, in India, amongst others. It is my privilege to invite Mr. Leo Saldanha to deliver his special lecture on the topic, Vulnerabilities of Indian Governance in Handling the Climate Crisis amid COVID-19 pandemic and recession. Thank you very much. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Simi. Thank you, Arjun, and thank you for this opportunity, IMPRI. I'm privileged to be participant in a conversation with all of you at a time when all of us are trying to grapple with a situation which is beyond our imaginations. And I'm using the word plural because all of us have different imaginations, and the particular situation that we now deal with has resulted in reviving our imaginations, and one of the common conversations is how long this will last. We don't have so much good news coming from science about how long this will last, because as we know, we have lost two members of parliaments from Karnataka. One of them is a union minister just in the last week, a week or 10 days. And then we lost a MP from Tamil Nadu. One of our MLAs passed away, I think yesterday or day before. Mr. S.P. Balasubramaniam, well-known singer across India, passed away a few hours ago. So, I mean, these are just reminders of how grave the situation is. And these are people who are notable. These are people who have all the support systems of the state, of the public and their families, and yet this disease has taken them. So in that sense, and several of us would have very personal accounts of friends who have passed on, and family members and so on. And every time we meet, and the fact that we are actually engaging this way is a reminder of how precarious our lives have become. It's not that the COVID was necessary to remind us of how precarious our lives are, considering what kind of situation we have had developing over the past decade and two. Scientists across the world have warned in many forms. One of them is the IPCC reports about the situation that is evolving across the world due to global warming. I prefer the term global warming than the rather dressed up term climate change, because global warming has a real feel to it, that the earth is warming up beyond what it should be. We need a warm blanket to take off the cold, but if you put 20 blankets on me, then I'm not going to be not only not comfortable, I may not even survive the heat that it generates. The Earth, I don't know at what stage it is at, but the news that came yesterday from a very critical scientific review is that the ice caps are melting, and rather fast. And if Antarctica melts, we'll have several meters of water rising in the oceans. One can only imagine what that means to India, where a major chunk of our population lives along the coastline, and say Bangladesh, for instance, which is largely just above sea level. And we have done everything possible in the last few decades to ensure that the natural defenses there are to protect land from sea have by and large been destroyed. And so here we are now dealing with another sort of indicator of how vulnerable humanity is on a living planet, where a virus apparently, as we are told, has jumped out of the wild and reached into our bodies, and we are helping communicate it because most of us are asymptomatic. That we hear that about 28 to 30% of Delhi population may have possibly been exposed already, does not seem to be very comforting, which means that when they were communicating the disease, they were moving about their daily lives. And so the question really to ask in this situation is, how has the Indian government or our Indian system of governance responded to this crisis? For which we really need to ask, how does India respond to crisis anyway? Now, there are fantastic examples of how India responds to crisis. For instance, we learned our lessons from the 1999 cyclone in Orissa, and subsequent cyclones have been very, very well, the response to subsequent cyclones has been extremely well organized. In that sense, India has learned and managed and also learned to govern responses to cyclones. But one of the problems with that way of response is that it uses emergency powers. It uses very strong police powers. But what about normative governance? Why is normative governance not always recognizing the fact that we need to be in a state of ever readiness? It's not necessary for us to wait for a crisis, because when the crisis has come, you don't look for solutions, you look to survive. So then the problem of governance becomes that we do not have an idea of what it does, and we don't know what solutions are the right ones. And then we move to the next one. So this is a kind of a situation India has got accustomed to over time, and particularly evident from the cycles almost every year of droughts and floods. This year particularly, the floods have been rather extensive across Northeast, across Bihar, across Madhya Pradesh, for instance. Who would have heard Madhya Pradesh would be flooded so extensively? And most of our metropolitan areas are so set up that they are not ready for even an excessive rainfall. It is not that is the only way cities can structure themselves, because we can learn from flooding in cities, for instance, that it is largely a result of maldevelopment. When we use the word development, we use it as if it's a positive thing, but development need not be positive. Most of the kind of development that we now see is maldevelopment, which means it has built-in maladies which governance fails to comprehend. But then governance in India has always been ahead of disasters. For instance, we have anticipated the fact that our governance was heavily centralized, particularly since the neoliberal economic policies were unleashed on this country early 90s. Governance is largely executive driven. It is not driven from a perspective of listening to people and understanding from people's wisdom and trying to figure out which is the right way to ensure everybody is safe, secure, and that the idea of progress that we so speak about in our constitution and every plan that we make, every scheme that is promoted, actually is secured. If that had happened, we would not have had the type of crisis we now have. So if this crisis or the type of crisis which we have dealt with over time, and all I'm now saying is the natural crisis, right? But then there is also an unnatural crisis which we create, as I shared with the way in which our cities are set up, that they tend to become a crisis because we have neglected the fundamental principles of planning, fundamental principles of governance. So if you were to ask what should be the fundamental principle of governance in a democratic society, then it has to be a very simple answer for it. A democracy by its innate sense, structure, meaning, and operational capacity has to be ground up. Because if we, the people, are creating a government to govern us, then the government is supposed to ensure that we, the people, are involved in the idea of governance, in the methods of governance, in the operationability of various governance institutions, and so on. But it's widely known that most of us and who live here experience that almost all aspects of governance are beyond our reach. They are inaccessible. So which is why in the early 90s, India learned, and if you read the kind of statement of objects and reasons for the amendment of the constitution in 1992, the result of which was the Panchayat Raj Act and the Nagarpalika Act, one of the key factors was that because of heavy over-centralization, our cities and our villages have become unmanageable. So since states, by and large, had not taken seriously the idea of what federalism means. Federalism is not just a sharing of power between the center and the state. Federalism is the sharing of power with people. People created this power so that it could be dealt with responsibility by the executive and the elected setup, but they seem to have usurped that power for their own ends. And their ends necessarily don't speak to the people's needs. So federalism in its true sense, and if we say we are a democratic federal state, then it should mean that we have understood that people have a role in almost all decisions, barring a few relating to national security and defense. Most decisions need not be intransparent. So for every one of those fundamental aspects of making democracy function, we have had to struggle. For instance, the Right to Information Act was a result of 2-3 decades of struggle. The Lokpal bill has never become real. So we may have a Lokpal which we don't know what it does. If you take the Forest Rights Act, one of the most progressive legislations to have come, and probably the last progressive legislation India has brought into effect, that was a result of decades of struggle of a large chunk of India's population, the Adivasis, who had been historically denied their right to participate in decision making. Their natural resources were taken away from them, and because they did not subscribe to the capitalist model of private enterprise and private asset building, they were seen as people who are occupying spaces which they had all the time nurtured for thousands and thousands of years. One can argue that if forests remain, it's largely because of Adivasis. And if you also look at it from that perspective, you can see that the forest department was set up on a colonial model as one of the most extractive and oppressive models. And the Forest Rights Act was meant to democratize our relationship with forests, make the forest department subordinate to people's will. But from 2006 to now, we have not implemented the Forest Rights Act, right? So these are indicators of the fact that we are extremely good in providing ourselves with the tools necessary to fix the governance maladies that we have, but then we proceed quickly to ignore them. And then we find excuses to ensure that those progressive models of governance are quickly suppressed for one reason or the other, and we create emergencies. Now, one can also see, for instance, the farming crisis that we now have. Today, as we speak, farmers across the country have called for a bandh. Why? Because 2 or 3 laws were passed without not just the farmers being participant in shaping their destiny, even the parliamentarians who wanted to discuss it were not allowed to. So this is a very clear indicator of a very, very, very structural displacement of the idea of democratic and federal politics that is crucial to make India work. Because India cannot work through a centralized dynamic. It will break up. And it will break up in ways which we cannot imagine perhaps. There have been many resistances across India over a long period of time. The Central Indian region is largely been, Shivraj Patil in 2007 in a speech in Parliament said about 40% of India's geographical spread was not within the control of the state, which means the state could not govern. What does that signify? It means then itself people were by and large disenchanted with the quality of governance and finding methods. You may not agree with it. You may disapprove of it. It may be illegal. It may be unconstitutional, but that is how they were trying to find meaning with their own lives. Now, in the northeastern region, most of the northeastern region has a problem of, people saying, but why is India a colonial power? And we know what Kashmir has done. The way in which we have done to Kashmir, for instance. From what Dr. Farooq Abdullah said after he was finally released, I don't know what that release constitutes because he's been allowed to speak now to the media. But for 1 year, you keep a former chief minister under house arrest. You kept 2 former chief ministers under house arrest. 3 actually, if you take Omar Abdullah. No, that quality of governance is what would constitute a draconian system, and you demonize the entire state. The entire state has suffered the loss of independence and autonomy. There were many intelligent ways out of it. But are we really looking for intelligent ways out? Or are we moving towards a process in which a fascist tendency is overcoming our democratic polity? And soon enough, if you are not alert, the idea of democracy may seem so far away. And perhaps it is already for most people who are considered to be political prisoners, arrested on a whim. Even leading ministers and opposition leaders are being picked up on charge sheets, which most people, I mean, if you open the TV, I mean, turn on the TV in the night in the last few days, it's all about, I mean, Salman Khurshid, for instance. So what kind of confidence do people draw from this democratic polity when anybody who questions the government is considered an anti-national, right? So now these are very important qualities in finding a response to the overall challenge that we have, which is climate change or global warming, which is a much more preferred term for me, in which the type of consequences that will impact people are largely unknown. Now, if you take a cue from what is happening with the west coast of the United States, I mean, amazingly, most people missed it because probably President Donald Trump occupies media space too much. But the East Coast was being battered by, very slow, very energetic, and very devastating typhoons. And the West Coast was being incinerated with unprecedented forest fires. I was imagining what would happen if the Western Ghats, I mean, now we are having rain, so you can't imagine the Western Ghats being dry. But suppose there is a long spell of dryness and the Western Ghats caught fire. And believe me, this actually happened 5 years ago in Karnataka. There were some at least 600 to 700 spots in the Western Ghats which caught fire, and the forest department could not tackle that. Now, the forest department is not designed to tackle that. They are not firefighting forces. They are meant to help keep forests going and not divert them for all sorts of non-forest purposes. But the idea here is that we are actually living through multiple crises all the time. We're just ignoring them. And sometimes they conflate and they create a situation in which we don't know what to do. Now, the current world cannot say, I don't know what to do. And I say this because when the lockdown was lifted, you would have seen that several industries started blowing up. LG Polymers, the lignite, power plant in Neyveli Lignite Corporation in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, 10-15 people died. I mean, there were hundreds of little industrial accidents because we are now living in a world where there's a complexity embedded in our normative living. So this complexity requires a certain type of living in which you have to be very careful, very calibrated, extremely, the forethought is critical. So all this needs to be part of your governance systems. And if your governance systems are so sensitive, only then your regulatory practices can also be sensitive, right? So regulatory practices will then be able to forewarn and take necessary action to shut down and not allow the wrong type of thing to happen. Now you see that these industries are blown up, but just a month, and let's not forget the oil wells blowing up in Assam. And for what, almost 1.5 to 2 months they were burning. So how much carbon has gone into the atmosphere by such colossal disasters? And what does that imply over time, right? So what does it mean to us going to IPCC and saying we are going to cut down on BS6, we are going to introduce BS6 and we are going beyond BS4, we are going to clean up the air. And then you have the industrial setup, which is so unprepared to deal with these type of, disasters. On the farming front, if you look at what kind of response the government has to the farming crisis, the response has largely been to monetize farming, to financialize land, to commodify crops, to turn the sovereign control over food and food systems, which is in the hands of the farmers, over to the corporate sector. Be it Indian or international, doesn't really matter. They're all now morphed into each other. Mukesh Ambani draws money from Mark Zuckerberg or KKR. It doesn't really matter. Or Walmart invests in something else. Even natural food and the whole movement, which was organic movement in farming, and the whole idea of creating natural farms has also been commodified, as we have learned from the so-called zero budget farming from Andhra Pradesh in particular. And Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister in the budget, even went on to institute it as part of the government's program in response to the farming crisis. Nobody has explained to us what that means. In a country where 60% of the population is reliant on farming and quite a big chunk is reliant on pastoralism, if you go and tell them we are going to do zero budget farming, what do farmers make out of that? And then they later on find that their land is now open for open buying. It's almost become like a stock market. Farming land has become like a stock market. So these are very, very serious crises we have created in governance. Now, what does that have to do with our response to COVID? I think plenty. So one of the first things that I recognized with the way in which the response started with COVID, and I'm also drawing heavily from research that my colleague Bhargavi and I are doing on behalf of ESG, and our team, ESG team, is doing along with an international group of researchers led by Sheila Jasanoff in Harvard Kennedy School and several others from across the world. About 20 countries are trying to understand how is COVID affecting governance, right? And in so doing that research, we have come up with, at least for the India study, about 5 or 6 focus areas. One is about political posturing. So we find that, one of the first things to ask is, most of Indian government's time was focused on how to invite Donald Trump for Namaste Trump. 100,000 people were in a stadium together in Ahmedabad. At that time, India had already 4 months of knowledge. Now, India surveils China, China surveils India, that's an open secret. So did we not know that when this outbreak took place in Wuhan, it is a serious thing? Could we not have, for instance, said, let's be much more careful, forget what WHO tells us or not, we are intelligent enough, let's protect Indians, let's protect ourselves. Maybe the step would have been to cancel the Namaste Trump and say, let international arrivals stop, because this is a disease which came from abroad. It didn't come because you and I spread it between Bangalore and Delhi and Bombay and so on. Now, you see that in that response, the international arrivals were taken care of in a very special way, but the populist response to the pandemic was to try and say the central government has it all under control and we are going to do it, right? And what did they employ? The Disaster Management Act. Now, the Disaster Management Act was not a law which was passed by this government. It was borrowed from what the Congress-led government passed in 2005, right? Now, we know well why we had the Disaster Management Act, because of the tsunami, right? Now, the tsunami was a huge learning process for us, because I recall very clearly that those regions which had very good local governments had the greatest capacity of response, relief, and rehabilitation. And those were centrally managed at devastation, right? You can see that actually across the region which was affected by the tsunami. So there was a lesson in which we could have said, let's decentralize our response to disasters like that and be ready for any type of epidemic or pandemic or whatever. And believe it or not, by 2008, we actually had guidelines to deal with pandemics. And at the opportunity, when the opportunity came to use those guidelines, we did not, because one of the first things that guidelines says, you have to build a response ground up. Build your systems in a way that people know where to seek help, and help will be provided to them. It talks about a language of compassion, a language where we look out for each other. We don't isolate ourselves. But yet the Prime Minister's populist response was, go out on your balconies and Tali Bajao. Now, it was a metaphor used to say that I am speaking necessarily and essentially to the middle class. Who else has balconies, right? And the balcony concept is not necessarily an homegrown concept. Most houses in India don't have balconies, except recently. So it is also Eurocentric thrusting of a response, which was totally unnecessary. Perhaps if the Prime Minister had said, let me find out where the public health centers are and see if they're functional. If they're not functional, let's on a war footing. I don't like the term war, but on that sense of response, ensure each and every public health center has a doctor, as a nurse, has the equipment required to do early testing, to make sure those who are infected are isolated, so the thing doesn't spread, right? it is common sense to do that. So why was our governance not able to respond in that way? So I think there is a very significant part of the response strategy was political posturing to show that the central government will deliver us from this pandemic. Now, anyone intelligent enough would see that that is not how you respond to pandemics, because a virus is not voting, right? A virus is one of the most misunderstood or totally non-understood thing that happens on this living planet. And it transmits so easily and so effectively and manages to take over the body that we should have learned from previous viral epidemics that the countries which succeeded, especially Southeast Asia, in South Korea and Hong Kong and so on, which survived SARS, is because they had created local units which could respond. They had created local behavioral shifts which could protect people. And we could have easily, the Prime Minister could have focused on that. The Home Minister could have focused on that. Each state government could have focused on that. And what we instead find is, except the state of Kerala and perhaps a couple of other states, most actually ignored it. And there was this thing, you know, about our centralized democracy, that the top man or woman, now it's a man, sends a message of how you need to behave. And here, what was the behavior pattern? Draw a Lakshman Rekha around yourself and stay safe and don't worry about your neighbor. That is the last thing you should communicate when there is a disease outbreak. When there is a disease, what the message should be: reach out and help each other, but take precautions. Ensure that nobody suffers unnecessarily. Make sure every doctor, every nurse, everyone who can do anything, volunteers are marshaled. In Bangalore, for instance, we started marshalling volunteers only a month ago. And that after they finally conceded that the centralized response strategy was actually not only failing, because, you know, the problem was the media is not free in India anymore. Most of the media is mainstream to focus attention on what? On parroting what they have been told, right? Very few media houses are actually independent of the state today, right? So in a sense, it's going back to the emergency days when everything that was said was glorious about Indira Gandhi and India, when the reality was very different, right? So in that sense, I think governance tells us that if you wanted to respond effectively, it needed a very deep, compassionate and decentralized approach, perhaps looking at the 73rd and 74th Amendment, perhaps taking the Epidemic Diseases Act as a method to respond where the states are empowered, perhaps talking to Pinarayi Vijayan and his team, Teacher Amma, for instance, who did a pretty good job of marshalling the panchayats and the gram sabhas and the wards and so on to try and defend the people of Kerala. And Kerala has a very, very high rate of international travel. So Kerala will be in a basket case, you know, very soon if they had not acted intelligently. So Kerala is so much safer now because of those type of intelligent responses by Dr. Thomas Isaac, for instance, and so on. So here we really see that the governance instruments that were employed were not only centralized and didactic, but they were also deliberately distracting attention from what was succeeding. So most of India, if you see the states which are worst affected, they are the states which were centrally governed. Karnataka, for instance, Maharashtra was in chaos, political chaos. As if the chaos was not necessary, we had one more chaos in Madhya Pradesh, right? And you'll see that the pandemic, which was not erupting there, suddenly erupts after that. The fact in which how the Delhi riots, for instance, is being used for political capital is distracting attention from the Delhi government. And it is really sad that Mr. Manish Sisodiya is now unwell because of COVID and perhaps dengue as well. These are all very bad indicators of governance. Chetan Chauhan passed away as a minister of the cabinet in Uttar Pradesh. I mean, one could go on. The point is that we have to critically analyze that when you have a didactic centralized system of administration which uses democratic processes to gloss over necessary steps, the public must be very alert, because that means governance is not carefully responding to the public needs and to public welfares and not providing the services that is required. So I think moving forward, what is really critical is to ask a bunch of questions. And in our research, we have come up with something like 35, 40 indicators. And one of the indicators that we have is, was there an effort to communalize this pandemic, right? The Tablighi Jamaat instance, in Bangalore, we had a riot, right? when the riots took place, we are now finding that there was a deliberate effort on the part of the police to use that to create an unnecessary situation. Peace could have been restored quite quickly if the police had operated in a very apt way. So that also means that people were left without any defenses against this disease, right? Or you take the question of education. We assume that every student has a cell phone, as if India has suddenly become a country like South Korea or something, right? And that we don't have any more problems of communication. I mean, I live in Bangalore, and my office is in South Bangalore, and I live further south, and I don't have internet most days. So if internet-based education was going to be the method, then obviously we should have asked, does it actually work? But today, someone came up with a question of why was television not used? Why was there a national law not brought into effect to say 40% of all TV channels shall be given to classrooms or some sort of education system, right? That you use this so that at least we have TV reach. So children could have sat in front of televisions like we used to do that with Doordarshan Times, right? So it also, it really means that we have a situation where the capitalization of public spaces, the financialization of public spaces, and the prioritization of the private sector needs has essentially meant that public sector and public services and public health and public goods has not become the priority for state. And when I say state, I really mean as a bulwark of state and central government together. But there are exceptions, worthy exceptions. And I think this is a wake-up call for India. It shows that the government the system of governance that we now have is not designed to protect us. So if this is the case, then the kind of the information that is flowing out from deep scientific inquiries, which are not based on any political bias, let's say, they have very disturbing news to share. And that is, this is not just going to be one pandemic. We are going to go into an age where infections are going to be much more frequent and much more widespread. So the kind of models that we have used in the past are not going to work. But one thing is very clear. The model that does work is where every village, every ward of every city is able to survive on its own capacity to govern itself. So to effectively decentralize, to hold political representatives accountable, to ensure that the flow of funds is rational. See, we have seen very disturbing trends here. The PM CARES fund has been set up to help us. But where is the money? You are asking, I am asking, MPs are asking, MLAs are asking, and we are told that the PM CARES fund, which is our money, we don't know what it's being invested in. What if it goes to something else? It was meant to go for the pandemic. It may well go for something else, right? So we have a very serious problem of intransparency with PM CARES. When it comes to the budget really made a lot of promises which nobody understood how it is going to be delivered because there was no money on the table. But the real test of the budget was the GST issue. When GST was being promoted both by Congress and the BJP, BJP opposed it, then BJP supported it, but let's get out of that politics. Finally, everybody agreed that GST is required. The idea was the state and center would share the resources from that common pool fund. And our finance minister tells all the state finance ministers, go and borrow because there is no money to give, right? If there is no money to give, where did the money go? What's happened to the money that was given? So, and this morning I read that India is going to invest in a project to buy Embraer, the aircraft company. And I was thinking, does it have to do with Bolsonaro having come here? He was the chief guest for Republic Day. Now, there was a time in India when we would be very careful of who is our chief guest. Bolsonaro doesn't come across as a democratic person at all. Most people consider him to be a fascist. And he forget patriarchy, he's a misogynist. And it's well documented. The fact that he won an election and has become a president of a country does not mean we should make him a chief guest of our country. But yet we did, and now we hear that we are going to probably participate in the purchase of one of their companies. Embraer is, I think, a Brazilian company or something. So point is this, that we seem to find money for bullet trains, Tatas and others. We found money for the Vista project, the Delhi Vista, thousands and thousands of crores, but we do not have money to pay for hospital bills. Just yesterday, we had 4 or 5 leading hospitals in Bangalore issued criminal notices because they were not admitting patients. Now, why? Because either patients cannot afford or they're not too sick. I've heard instances where many instances where if you're not too sick, you're not allowed. You should be very, very sick so that the ICU billings go up. And we are hearing from the assembly debates yesterday, billings between 10 to 16 lakhs for COVID. Now, I have had friends from England who I talked to who have been in the thick of the COVID battle, and there the NHS has worked to ensure that everybody can afford it. So even in deeply capitalist societies, health is not an issue of whether you have money or not. Spain went ahead and ensured that the entire hospital system, health system, was nationalized so that people's lives could be saved. See, the COVID problem is this. If you fall sick and recover from COVID, it doesn't mean you have become well. We are now learning that post-COVID problems are pretty serious. Cardiac arrest has become much more frequent. Dean Jones died yesterday. He didn't have COVID, but maybe other causes, but lots and lots of people are succumbing to heart attacks. I lost a friend to an heart attack because he had COVID, right? So what do we make out of a state which does not realize that in a country which is highly prone to heart disease, highly prone to diabetes, highly prone to infection because of the way in which we have organized our country, our cities and our villages and so on, we don't have a governance system that is actually attending to the problem. Instead, Sushant Singh Rathore is our problem. Poor guy, he had a mental illness. Can we not let him rest in peace? Why are we making that the issue? Right? Why are we as people not responding? So is this how we are going to respond to global warming and its worst impacts, which could be rise in sea levels, which could be catastrophic flooding, which could be rainfall, which is so intense that cities will not be able to? Are we going to turn attention from the floods in the city to some other Bollywood instance or some other political instance? Is this the method? Right? So I think these are all indicators of a very, very, not just dysfunctional, but a flawed, deeply flawed and deliberately deeply flawed response, because there may be other agendas rather than attending to people's needs and people's welfare. I will stop there and we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. You certainly left us thinking out loud, and of course, thank you very much for your scintillating talk. With your permission, I would now like to begin with the question and answers session. And I would like to pose to you a first question that is starting from where you had begun, that we need India to be in the state of ever readiness. And of course, preparedness to crisis as that posed by COVID-19 is needed in India. So do you think that ecological challenges or ecological changes that have their implications beyond the states and the nation's boundaries could have already had or is continuing to have an impact on the cooperative nature of India's federalism? If so, why and what needs to be done? And closely related to this question is one posed by Professor Balveer Arora, who thanks you for your scintillating talk. And he says that your emphasis on functional local self-government institutions being at the core of the multilateral federal system is very relevant for our present times. Mr. Ramkrishna Hegde was a pioneer in this field along with Mr. Abdul Nazir. So to what do you attribute this decline in Karnataka? If you could take these questions, we'll come back after your response. Thank you, sir.
These are all very big questions, and I hope I can do justice to them. But let me start with Balveer Arora's question about Nazir Saab. It's important that you have brought his name up because we used to call him Neer Saab. Neeru in Kannada means water, and he was a man who would walk across the state to find out villages which did not have water and make sure that local decentralized systems were provided to ensure they had water security. And one of the major instruments Abdul Nazir Saab promoted was to rehabilitate the tank irrigation systems so that water security would be there. Now, water security would mean health security. That's very simple to understand, right? But that neglect, which is from 1980s to now, 4 decades, almost 3-4 decades, really is an indicator of how centralized our system has become. Both during the UPA regime and also the NDA regime, I would say from the 1990s, India has stepped away from the idea of decentralization. Except, we always say Kerala, West Bengal. I mean, come on, we have 28, 30 states now. The number has increased because of the abrogation of 370. Why don't we have 40% or 50% of India decentralized? Why don't we have 70% of India decentralized? Why can't that be an indicator? So I think cooperative federalism is a nice terminology to use to remind ourselves of how far away we have gone from the constitutional promise, which was that. The idea was that the center was not meant to dominate states. We are a council of states. The center was supposed to organize us and allow states to function independently and autonomously, and the states in turn would ensure local governments, panchayats and nagarpalikas, would become mature institutions. I'm writing something and I managed to read the speeches made by Lord Ripon in 1885, I think, I'm not sure, in which he talks about the importance of local governance to ensure that the quality of life improves. And interestingly, there are a lot of studies that the British themselves did in the subsequent decades, and they found that actually quality of life improved when local government units were, I mean, he's considered to be the father of local government, local self-government in India, and a Britisher at that, and a British viceroy. Subsequent studies reveal that even in the early 1900s, the British suddenly found that local governments were becoming the bedrock for the emergence, the strengthening of freedom movement. So many of our freedom fighters, fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers, were local councillors first. And that's where they understood their politics and understood their responsibility, understood ethics of public administration, and used it to fight for our freedom, right? And the British found it very disturbing, and they started disrupting local self-government that Ripon had initiated. So you can see it's a very, very potent force. And unless you have local self-government, I don't think we can meet disasters. You can try and push as much as, like we had this major disaster in Bangalore. We had a commissioner called Anil Kumar, and we had the chief minister. They sat together and they decided we needed a 10,000 bed COVID facility. A huge area was taken up. Hundreds of crores were spent. Nobody, I mean, eventually we came to know that less than 1,000 people went there for treatment. A 10,000 bed facility was created overnight and not used, and it was shut down last week. That decision would not have been taken if local governments, they would say, why should I travel so far for COVID? You bring the treatment to where I am. I am sick in my house. Make sure I get well in my house. That would have been the response. So I think then the whole idea of governance would be re-engineered to ensure that people are safe wherever they are. You don't need to go to a tertiary care or a secondary care hospital, because most of your ailments can be taken care of locally with the type of intelligence human systems have gathered over time. And there is plenty of it. And we need to make space for those intelligence systems to become, to mainstream and become normative to our functioning. I hope I've answered both those questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for responding to these questions. So a couple of questions have come up on the chat box. One is, in fact, both are linking the political ideology of the ruling party, and especially when the Bihar elections have been announced. So do you think conducting political rallies would be, whether it is a right fit at this moment, whether it is the right decision that has been taken to conduct the elections during this time, and a direct question on, does the ideology of the ruling party, is in itself lacking idea about climate change, the pandemic, and also the prevailing economic recession? So your quick take on this, sir?
Sure. First one about the elections. I think, there's a study from Indian Institute of Science which came last week, and it said that up to 6 crore people can be infected. I mean, they were saying that current estimates are probably 8 to 9 times underestimated. All right. So we don't know. And another study from UK came, USA modeled and said up to 10% of India's population would be infected. And this pandemic will probably continue till next March or later. We don't know, right? But we are seeing that because of mismanagement and gross malgovernance, we are making the problem worse. We're not even stepping into the right direction. We're just going in the wrong way. So elections, I think, are necessary, and we have the necessary intelligence to organize them, because the other option is what? Right? Having a centrally driven way of managing Bihar. You see, that would be, I mean, without having even a chief minister and a council of ministers there, that would mean the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, will be ruling Bihar by and large. So what does that imply? So I think we should worry about that alternative. About the ideology of ruling party, of course, it has an impact on the BJP, for instance, has shown through the EIA notification draft 2020 that it simply does not bother about what the world is talking. Everything about the EIA notification is to say the IPCC doesn't matter, IPBES reports don't matter, whatever the WHO says doesn't matter, whatever India's movements, which I've said over decades, in terms of how we should not allow Adanis and Ambanis to, I mean, they are bigger than the East India Company in terms of their capacity to devour our natural resources for whose profit? Not mine, not yours. It's Mr. Mukesh Ambani becomes the richest man. What is my gain in that? What is a farmer's gain in that? What is a fisher folk's gain in that, right? So I think we have walked away from Article 39, which said that the means of production should be so that public good is assured, not just the goal. It has to be assured, which means the means of production today is accumulation of wealth. And it actually says that also. It should not lead to accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. And Mr. Narendra Modi and Nirmala Sitharaman's policies are to ensure the super rich become more rich and dominate our lives, control our information flows, control our health data, ensure that every act of ours is governed by them and as directed by them. I mean, the recent documentary Social Dilemma speaks very eloquently to the high risks that we have in relying on this type of communication strategy, social media. It is actually taking humanity away from humanism. And that's a huge danger, which we should not have. And the current ideology of the right and also the Hindutva-based ideology is about divisiveness. It is not about compassion.
Thank you very much. Yes, so these are the political implications of environmental challenges during COVID-19. So, sir, there's a question as to, we have all seen and witnessed that the nature bounced back due to the lockdown that was imposed due to low fossil fuel activities. But of course, this has come at a huge economic cost. And this has been described by some scholars as being inhumane. And the fact that we have very limited time to restrain the global temperature to within 1.5 degrees Celsius vis-a-vis the pre-industrial times, the results of which otherwise would be far worse than that of COVID-19. So how do you see India's trajectory of commitments of NDCs as against their implementation in the current scenario?
So first thing, the so-called clean environment that we got for a few months. I mean, wonderful. I could breathe. I could move about without suffering attacks on my lungs. And most of us experienced that. Now, the point is that that was so surreal in many ways because we have all grown up in polluted environments, right? And finally, we understood what it is to, one of the most remarkable aspects of that was India became quiet. Not just the air became clean. India became quiet. We are one of the noisiest countries in the world. And the quietness actually probably built our health. If there was noise and there was smoke and there was dust and there was pandemic, I don't know what the result would have been. But that said, I don't think we should rely on these type of harsh measures as the lockdown, because the lockdown was totally unplanned. It was centrally driven. It was draconian, and the migrant crisis, that the fact that the parliament is not told or is told that they have no data. What is the government doing? If you don't know, I mean, everybody knows how many people walked. Why can't they admit to the fact that it was massive numbers? 2 crore people walked, right? So where are they? Are they taken care of? Have they been given some sort of, help so that, post walking hundreds of kilometers, your body breaks down? They probably are much more vulnerable than others, right? So it was the most horrific thing that happened globally during the lockdowns. Most countries went through it, but we are the only ones to have the distinction of making the most vulnerable suffer even more. That doesn't speak well for our so-called ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right? So that, I think, is a very serious thing. But apart from that, if you have to go towards the NDCs and the commitments we make, as I said before, it's one thing to go and sign all these documents. I mean, India is one of the countries which rushes to sign all the international documents. I think we have 10 people in the Ministry of Environment, for instance, who go and sign all the documents and come back and ratify it. And then they work within the ministry to destroy everything that they have ratified, as they have done with the EIA notification. And there are many, look at the land laws, look at the Land Reform Act of Karnataka being amended. To whose benefit? Not the farmers, not the pastoralists. Common lands are being diverted for all sorts of industrial things. We have a law which was passed in Karnataka in which now you don't need to even take any of the normative regulatory permissions to divert agricultural land and commons for industrial and infrastructure development. Now, what we know will happen is a capture. This is land grab. This land grab will result in dispossession at a time when we actually need to make sure that people are connected with the land and learn to live off the land. That means we should encourage more farming, more natural farming, agroecological approaches. Fishing communities should not be disrupted. Pastoral communities should be allowed to go back to their natural ways. Then they are sovereign people. They are willing, they know how to live without the support of the state. So we have to allow them to go back and reclaim those territories which are taken away over time. But instead what we're doing is displacing them, and they will all unfortunately end up in cities. And the cities are already set up for greater disasters. So there is not so much good news from the way in which governance is going now. But what good news we can take is that we know what type of government we have. It has shown its ugly face. It has shown its brutal face. It has shown that it does not care. Now that is great. There's no way you can hide that. If we can actually, as intelligent people, converse and talk to each other and make sure that we transform this situation. So I think there's a huge possibility of transformation that can take place now because we know the nature of the problem.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So lastly, sir, we come to the last question on taking cue from the governance conundrum, which you just spoke about. What are the takeaway lessons that you think would be vital to inform a science-based climate action strategy amid the COVID-19 uncertainties in India? So your few takeaway lessons.
When you say a science-based climate action strategy, we try to say that science got produced in labs. We have worked with hundreds of communities across India who are natural, Adivasi, farming, pastoral communities. Some of the richest knowledge we have about plants and animals and everything else, and about the nature of weather and weather pattern shifts and soil, the texture of soil and so on, and I mean, you can go on, is from these people. The fact that they don't sit and write PhDs and write technical papers does not mean they don't possess knowledge. And that has actually been protected by law. The Biodiversity Act is based on protecting traditional knowledge and wisdom, which we signed up in the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is part of the UN CED, right? Rio Declaration. Now, having said that, if you look at the way in which science is being employed, right? Today we have a serious crisis because in the middle of a pandemic, the government has opened up field trials for Bt brinjal in at least 8 or 9 states. The Supreme Court has not heard the challenge against the threat that GMO has to India's food sovereignty and food security, because it will turn the food systems into proprietary systems. And worse, it will also turn it genetically contaminated. So we can never have the natural system that we can lean on in the worst situations moving forward. And as we move forward, we need to look back more at traditional knowledge and wisdom, and that would have gone, right? Because most of those varieties will have disappeared. There's a case we are fighting in the Supreme Court, which has not been heard for 7-8 years now, and that's about protecting India's biodiversity from biopiracy. That should have been a very serious problem for any court to attend to, and 3 chief justices have heard, and they have not taken a decision, right? So what it means to me is that if India's biodiversity does not matter to us at the highest level of judicial scrutiny, then what is the point of going and making speeches, having a climate summit in Delhi, promoting solar parks? And solar parks are also being promoted as if it's going to solve the problem. It is in fact going to devastate our landscapes, the way in which we are now putting up massive solar parks. So I think we are, and think about also the number of dams that have been promoted in the Northeast. So we probably don't want to learn from science that such zoonotic diseases actually jump out of forests into our human systems because we make ourselves vulnerable by destroying forests, destroying wetlands, contaminating soils, right? So our immunity levels are dropping because the nature of our food is weak. There used to be times people say when they could have 1 meal and they would feel energetic all through the day. Now you can have 3 meals and feel weak all through the day. So I think most of the foods that come into our supermarkets are not properly packaged or not properly scrutinized, which means most food that is being delivered through the food supply chains is largely not nourishing. So when you are looking at a pandemic, we have to really think of it as an opportunity to fix all of these problems at once and collectively and together. And there's no better way of doing it than from the ground up, because there is a lot of latent wisdom. We have to listen to it. Civil servants, especially the IAS people who have been dominating the scene for the last 6 months, they should step back and allow elected representatives to work with the people and provide durable solutions. I think that's the way forward. And I think scientists should also learn to go down to the local levels and work with people rather than just relying on, prime minister's interventions or chief minister's interventions. Science has to decentralize itself.
Absolutely, sir. I totally agree. In fact, there was a news just today in Jharkhand that there is a community, Adivasi community, the Tana Bhagats, who have kept themselves immune from this disease, from COVID-19, because of their indigenous practices and their naturally inbuilt practices of hygiene, sanitation, and they are not even taking care of all these so-called maintaining social distancing and all those things that are there in place for everybody else to follow. So certainly we have a lot to learn from the indigenous.
I had a friend, KP Sashi, was a well-known documentary filmmaker. He was spent 2 months with the Adivasi community in Nagarole, and he says nobody has COVID. But he went and met the forest officials and everybody has COVID, or at least quite a few officials have COVID. And he said the reason could be because the Adivasi foods are very, very diverse and they are, physically distanced. They're not socially distanced. They're socially bonded, but physically distanced. So unfortunately, the wrong message has gone out from the Prime Minister all the way down that we have to social distance. We should not social distance. We should socially bond, but physically distance.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your enlightening lecture and for delivering this special talk on the state of the environment. And certainly there is a need to step up on our ever readiness and the preparedness to the natural calamities and pandemics like COVID-19. I'm so grateful on behalf of Team Impact and Policy Research Institute for sparing your time and for this wonderful lecture. And lastly, I would thank all the audience watching us live on Facebook and also on Zoom, and our media partner, India Water Portal, for taking time and for your constant support. We look forward to having you again. And thank you very much, sir, for your presence.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a very good evening, sir.